The galaxy had been quiet for a very long time. Not the quiet of empty space. The quiet of order. The quiet of empires that had solved every problem and crushed every rebellion. 3 great powers ruled the stars. The Voth, the Kryll, and the Xylos. Each was perfect in its own way. Each believed its way was the only way. Each had ruled for tens of thousands of years. The Voth were the oldest. They had perfected logic. Every decision was calculated. Every outcome was predicted. Their cities were built in straight lines. Their laws were written in clear language. Their society had no arguments because arguments were illogical. The Voth did not guess. They did not wonder. They did not hope. They calculated. And their calculations were never wrong. The Kryll were the strongest. They had perfected strength. The strong ruled. The weak served. That was the law. Kryll children were tested at birth. The weak were left to die. The strong were trained to fight. Their empire had no mercy because mercy was weakness. The Kryll did not cry. They did not help. They did not love. They conquered. And their conquests never failed. The Xylos were the wisest. They had perfected knowledge. They collected everything. Every fact. Every secret. Every truth. Their libraries held the history of the galaxy. Their scientists had mapped every star. Their scholars had translated every language. The Xylos did not ask questions. They already knew the answers. They did not seek. They already had. They did not learn. They remembered. And their memories never faded. For tens of thousands of years, the 3 empires had ruled. They had fought each other sometimes. They had made peace sometimes. But they had never changed. They had never grown. They had never questioned themselves. They were perfect. And perfection, they believed, was eternal. Then they discovered humans. The humans came from a small blue planet at the edge of known space. They were young. Their history was short. Their technology was simple. Their bodies were soft. The Voth studied them and found them illogical. The Kryll tested them and found them weak. The Xylos catalogued them and found them ignorant. The empires were not impressed. They ignored the humans. They went back to their perfect lives. But the humans did not go away. They spread across the galaxy. They built colonies on dead worlds. They traded with alien species. They asked questions. Stupid questions. Dangerous questions. Questions that had no answers. The Voth heard the questions and frowned. The Kryll heard the questions and laughed. The Xylos heard the questions and turned away. Questions were for children. Questions were for the ignorant. Questions were for humans. One human asked a question that changed everything. Her name was Dr. Amora Chen. She was a philosopher, a thinker, a questioner. She had studied the 3 empires. She had read their histories. She had learned their laws. And she had found a flaw. A small flaw. A hidden flaw. A flaw that none of the empires had ever noticed because none of them had ever asked. She wrote an essay. She called it The Tyranny of Certainty. It was short, simple, clear. It asked one question. What if you are wrong? The essay spread. Humans shared it with each other. They posted it on walls. They whispered it in the streets. They sent it to alien worlds. The Voth read it and frowned. The Kryll read it and laughed. The Xylos read it and turned away. But the question stayed. It sat in the back of their minds like a seed. A small seed. A quiet seed. A seed that would grow. The Voth tried to ignore the question. They ran their calculations. They made their predictions. Everything was fine. Everything was perfect. But the question kept returning. What if you are wrong? They had never asked that question before. They had never needed to. Their logic was perfect. But what if it was not? What if there were things logic could not reach? What if the universe was not a puzzle to be solved but a mystery to be explored? The Voth had no answer. They had never needed an answer. They had only needed certainty. And now certainty was gone. The Kryll tried to crush the question. They punished anyone who spoke it. They banned the essay. They threatened the humans. But the question kept returning. What if you are wrong? The Kryll had never asked that question before. They had never needed to. Their strength was absolute. But what if it was not? What if there were things strength could not conquer? What if the weak had value? What if mercy was not weakness but courage? The Kryll had no answer. They had never needed an answer. They had only needed power. And now power was not enough. The Xylos tried to forget the question. They buried the essay in their deepest libraries. They erased it from their records. They pretended it had never existed. But the question kept returning. What if you are wrong? The Xylos had never asked that question before. They had never needed to. Their knowledge was complete. But what if it was not? What if there were things knowledge could not capture? What if wisdom was more than facts? What if the greatest truth was that some truths could not be known? The Xylos had no answer. They had never needed an answer. They had only needed certainty. And now certainty was gone. The empires did not fall overnight. It took years, decades, generations. But the seed had been planted. The question had been asked. And once a question is asked, it cannot be unasked. Once a doubt is born, it cannot be killed. The Vorth began to argue. The Kryll began to question. The Xylos began to wonder. The perfect empires, built on logic and strength and knowledge, began to crack. And it had all started with one human. One essay. One question. What if you are wrong? The galaxy would never be the same. The humans had not fired a single shot. They had not built a single weapon. They had not conquered a single world. They had simply asked a question. And that question was more powerful than any army. Because armies can be defeated. Weapons can be destroyed. Empires can fall. But a question lives forever. It grows in the dark. It waits for the right moment. And when that moment comes, it changes everything. The Vorth, the Kryll, and the Xylos had ruled for tens of thousands of years. They had believed they were eternal. They had been wrong. They had forgotten the one thing that humans never forget. That no system is perfect. That every rule has exceptions. That certainty is a lie. And that the most dangerous thing in the universe is not a bomb or a virus or a weapon. It is an idea. A simple idea. A human idea. The idea that maybe, just maybe, you are wrong. The human idea was simple. So simple that the aliens had never thought of it. The Vorth had never thought of it because their minds were full of logic. The Kryll had never thought of it because their minds were full of strength. The Xylos had never thought of it because their minds were full of knowledge. None of them had ever considered that the rules themselves could be changed. They had followed the same rules for tens of thousands of years. They had never questioned. They had never doubted. They had never wondered. The humans wondered all the time. Dr. Amora Chen was a philosopher. She lived in a small house by the sea. She spent her days reading and thinking and writing. She was not famous. She was not rich. She was just a woman who asked questions. She had studied the three great empires. She had read their histories. She had learned their laws. And she had noticed something strange. The empires had not changed in tens of thousands of years. They had solved every problem. They had answered every question. They had stopped growing. Amora thought about this for a long time. She sat by the window and watched the waves. She drank tea and stared at the sky. She asked herself the same question over and over. Why did they stop? The answer came to her slowly. Like the sunrise. Like the tide. Like the truth. They stopped because they believed they were perfect. The Vorth believed logic could solve everything. The Kryll believed strength could conquer everything. The Xylos believed knowledge could explain everything. None of them had ever considered that they might be wrong. None of them had ever considered that the rules could be changed. Amora wrote an essay. She called it The Tyranny of Certainty. It was short, simple, clear. She wrote it in plain language so that anyone could understand. She did not use big words or complicated ideas. She just told the truth. No system is perfect, she wrote. Every rule has exceptions. Every answer leads to new questions. Certainty is not strength. It is a cage. Change is not weakness. It is growth. The universe is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a mystery to be explored. The only real mistake is to stop asking questions. She sent the essay to a friend. The friend sent it to another friend. That friend posted it on a wall. Someone else read it aloud in a cafe. Someone else translated it into another language. The essay spread. Not through official channels. Not through governments or empires. Through people. Through whispers and conversations and shared ideas. The way all important ideas spread. The Vorth read the essay. They frowned. They did not like it. The essay asked questions that had no answers. It suggested that logic had limits. It implied that certainty was a lie. The Vorth tried to ignore it. They went back to their calculations. But the questions stayed. What if you are wrong? What if there are things logic cannot reach? What if the universe is not a puzzle? The Vorth had no answers. They had never needed answers. They had only needed certainty. Now certainty was gone. The Kryll read the essay. They laughed. They did not understand it. The essay talked about change and growth and questions. The KRYLL did not care about questions. They cared about strength. But the words stayed. No system is perfect. Every rule has exceptions. The KRYLL had never considered that their rule might have exceptions. Strength was everything. The weak served. That was the law. But what if the law was wrong? What if the weak had value? What if mercy was not weakness? The KRYLL had no answers. They had never needed answers. They had only needed strength. Now strength was not enough. The Xylos read the essay. They turned away. They did not want to see it. The essay suggested that knowledge without wisdom was empty. That some things could not be known. That the greatest truth might be that some truths were hidden. The Xylos had spent millennia collecting facts. They believed that knowledge was power. But what if knowledge was not enough? What if wisdom was more important? What if the search for answers was more valuable than the answers themselves? The Xylos had no answers. They had never needed answers. They had only needed knowledge. Now knowledge felt hollow. The essay spread across the galaxy. It reached worlds that had never heard of Earth. It was translated into 1,000 languages. It was read by scholars and soldiers and farmers and children. Some hated it. Some loved it. Some did not understand it. But no one could ignore it. The idea was out there. The rules could be changed. Young Vorth began to ask questions. Their elders had no answers. The council splintered. Debates raged for years. The Vorth Empire, once united, began to crack. Young KRYLL began to doubt. Their generals had no answers. Soldiers refused to fight. The weak were no longer left to die. The KRYLL Empire, once invincible, began to crumble. Young Xylos began to wonder. Their scholars had no answers. Libraries were burned. Not by enemies. By scholars who had lost faith in facts. The Xylos Empire, once wise, fell into silence. The empires did not fall because of a weapon. They did not fall because of a war. They fell because of an idea. A simple idea. A human idea. The idea that the rules could be changed. Dr. Amora Chen watched from her small house by the sea. She did not celebrate. She did not cheer. She just watched the waves and drank her tea. She had not meant to destroy the empires. She had only meant to ask a question. But questions, she knew, were more powerful than any weapon. Because weapons could be defeated. Armies could be crushed. Empires could fall. But a question lived forever. It grew in the dark. It waited for the right moment. And when that moment came, it changed everything. The galaxy was changing. The old certainties were gone. The new questions were just beginning. And somewhere, on a small blue planet, a philosopher smiled. She had done what no army could do. She had asked a question. And the universe was finally listening. The Vorth were the first to fall. They had ruled for longer than any species in the galaxy. Their empire was built on logic. Every decision was calculated. Every outcome was predicted. Their cities were straight lines. Their laws were clear sentences. Their minds were sharp and certain. They had no doubts. They had no questions. They had no fear. Then the human idea came. The idea was simple. Too simple. The Vorth had never thought of it. The rules can be changed. They read the words. They frowned. They tried to ignore them. But the words stayed. They sat in the back of Vorth minds like a stone in a shoe. Uncomfortable. Impossible to forget. At first, the Vorth tried to argue against the idea. They wrote long essays proving that logic was absolute. They held meetings where they repeated their certainties. They banned the human essay from their libraries. Nothing worked. The idea did not go away. It grew. It spread. It changed. Young Vorth began to ask questions. Small questions at first. Why do we do things this way? Their elders had answers. Because it is logical. The young Vorth nodded. They accepted the answers. But the questions did not stop. They grew larger. What if there are things logic cannot reach? The elders had no answers. They had never considered the question. They had never needed to. Logic was everything. Logic was enough. But what if it was not? The young Vorth kept asking. They gathered in small groups. They talked late into the night. They read the human essay again and again. They began to see cracks in their perfect society. Cracks that had always been there but that no one had ever noticed because no one had ever looked. Why do we execute the old? Asked a young Vorth named Kale. They are not useful. They cannot calculate. They cannot predict. They are a drain on resources. So we end their lives. It is logical. Her elder nodded. Yes, it is logical. But what if logic is not the only measure of value? Kale asked. What if an old Vorth has wisdom that cannot be calculated? What if their memories have worth? What if their presence brings comfort? The elder had no answer. He had never thought about comfort. Comfort was not logical. Comfort could not be measured. Comfort was not part of the calculation. But Kale's question stayed with him. It grew. It spread. It changed. Why do we abandon the weak? Asked another young Vorth named Seri. They cannot contribute. They cannot work. They cannot fight. So we leave them to die. It is logical. Her elder nodded. Yes, it is logical. But what if logic is not the only measure of worth? Seri asked. What if a weak Vorth has a kind heart? What if their presence makes others stronger? What if helping them makes us better? The elder had no answer. He had never thought about kindness. Kindness was not logical. Kindness could not be predicted. Kindness was not part of the calculation. But Seri's question stayed with him. It grew. It spread. It changed. Why do we never change? Asked a young Vorth named Vex. Our society has been the same for tens of thousands of years. We make the same decisions. We reach the same conclusions. We never grow. It is logical. His elder nodded. Yes, it is logical. Change is inefficient. Change introduces errors. Change is not logical. But what if change is necessary? Vex asked. What if the universe changes? What if new problems arise? What if the old solutions no longer work? What if logic itself needs to evolve? The elder had no answer. He had never thought about evolution. Evolution was not logical. Evolution was random. Evolution was not part of the calculation. But Vex's question stayed with him. It grew. It spread. It changed. The questions spread like fire. Young Vorth asked them everywhere. In homes. In schools. In council chambers. The elders tried to answer. They tried to explain. They tried to maintain order. But the questions kept coming. And the answers grew weaker. The council splintered. Some elders agreed with the young. They said that change was necessary. That logic had limits. That questions were not enemies but friends. Other elders disagreed. They said that the old ways were best. That logic was absolute. That questions were dangerous. The two sides argued for years. The arguments grew louder. The divisions grew deeper. The Vorth Empire, once united, broke into 1,000 pieces. Not because of war. Because of a question. A simple question that the Vorth had never asked themselves. What if you are wrong? The pieces drifted apart. Some Vorth followed the old ways. They built new colonies where logic still ruled. They were smaller now. Weaker. Less certain. Other Vorth followed the new ways. They built colonies where questions were welcome. Where change was possible. Where growth was encouraged. They were smaller too. But they were alive. They were growing. They were changing. The galaxy watched the Vorth fall. The KRYLL and the Xylos saw what had happened. They were afraid. Not of the Vorth. Of the question. The question that had destroyed the oldest empire in the galaxy. The question that could destroy them too. But the question could not be stopped. It was already spreading. Already growing. Already changing. The KRYLL would be next. The Xylos would follow. The human idea was a wave. And the wave was rising. Dr. Amora Chen watched from Earth. She saw the Vorth Empire break apart. She felt no joy. Only a deep, quiet sadness. She had not meant to destroy anything. She had only meant to ask a question. But questions, she knew, had power. Power to break. Power to build. Power to change. She looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, young Vorth were building something new. Something uncertain. Something alive. Something human. She smiled. The old empire was gone. But something else was being born. Something that asked questions. Something that doubted. Something that grew. Something that was not perfect. Something that was human. And that, she thought, was not destruction. That was evolution. The KRYLL were next. They had watched the Vorth fall. They had seen the questions spread. They had felt the fear grow. But the KRYLL were not like the Vorth. They did not think. They did not question. They acted. Their society was built on strength. The strong ruled. The weak served. That was the law. It had always been the law. It would always be the law. The KRYLL believed this with every fiber of their being. Then the human idea came. The idea was simple. Too simple. The KRYLL had never thought of it. The rules can be changed. They heard the words. They laughed. Rules could not be changed. Strength was everything. Weakness was nothing. That was the truth. That was the only truth. The KRYLL generals tried to crush the idea. They banned the human essay. They punished anyone who spoke of it. They threatened the humans with destruction. Nothing worked. The idea did not go away. It spread through the ranks like a sickness. Young soldiers began to question. Their generals had no answers. What if strength is not the only measure of worth? Asked a young KRYLL soldier named Vex. He had been born weak. He should have been left to die. But his mother had hidden him. She had raised him in secret. He had grown strong enough to pass the tests. But he had never forgotten. He had never forgotten that he should have died. He had never forgotten that his mother had risked everything to save him. He had never forgotten that the law was not always right. His general laughed. Strength is everything. The weak serve. That is the law. But what if the law is wrong? Vex asked. What if the weak have value? What if kindness matters? What if mercy is not weakness but courage? The general had no answer. He had never thought about kindness. He had never thought about mercy. He had never thought about courage. He only thought about strength. But Vex's question stayed with him. It grew. It spread. It changed. Other soldiers began to ask questions. Why do we leave the weak to die? Asked a soldier named Seri. She had watched her brother be taken away as a child. He had been small. He had been gentle. He had been kind. The KRYLL had left him on a cold hillside to die. Seri had never forgotten his face. She had never forgotten his voice. She had never forgotten that the law had killed someone she loved. Her general frowned. The weak are a burden. They cannot fight. They cannot work. They cannot contribute. They are useless. But what if they are not useless? Seri asked. What if a weak person can love? What if they can create art? What if they can make others happy? What if their presence makes us better? The general had no answer. He had never thought about love. He had never thought about art. He had never thought about happiness. He only thought about strength. But Seri's question stayed with him. It grew. It spread. It changed. Why do we never help each other? Asked a soldier named Kale. He had been injured in battle. His comrades had left him to die. He had survived alone. He had crawled to safety. He had healed himself. He had never forgotten that no one had helped him. He had never forgotten that the law had left him for dead. His general shrugged. Helping the weak makes us weak. Every KRYLL must stand alone. That is the law. But what if helping makes us stronger? Kale asked. What if a wounded soldier can heal and fight again? What if a kind word can lift a warrior's spirit? What if we are better together than alone? The general had no answer. He had never thought about together. He had never thought about healing. He had never thought about spirit. He only thought about strength. But Kale's question stayed with him. It grew. It spread. It changed. The question spread through the KRYLL empire like fire. Soldiers refused to fight. Generals lost their authority. The weak were no longer left to die. The strong were no longer worshipped. The KRYLL empire, once invincible, crumbled from within. Not because of war. Because of questions. The Xylos were last. They had watched the Vorth fall. They had watched the KRYLL crumble. They had felt the fear grow. But the Xylos were not like the Vorth or the KRYLL. They were wise. They knew everything. Their libraries held the history of the galaxy. Their scientists had mapped every star. Their scholars had translated every language. They believed that knowledge was power. They believed that knowing everything was the highest goal. Then the human idea came. The idea was simple. Too simple. The Xylos had never thought of it. The rules can be changed. They read the words. They turned away. They did not want to see. They buried the essay in their deepest libraries. They erased it from their records. They pretended it had never existed. But the idea did not go away. It grew. It spread. It changed. Young Xylos began to question. What if knowledge without wisdom is empty? Asked a young scholar named Vexa. She had spent her whole life collecting facts. She knew the name of every star. She knew the history of every species. She knew the answer to every question. But she was not happy. She was not fulfilled. She was not wise. Her elder frowned. Knowledge is wisdom. Facts are truth. There is nothing else. But what if there is? Vexa asked. What if wisdom is more than facts? What if understanding is more than knowing? What if some things cannot be known? What if the search for answers is more valuable than the answers themselves? The elder had no answer. He had never thought about wisdom. He had never thought about understanding. He had never thought about the search. He only thought about knowledge. But Vex's question stayed with him. It grew. It spread. It changed. Other scholars began to question. Why do we collect facts if we do nothing with them? Asked a scholar named Seri. She had spent her life translating ancient texts. She had learned languages that no one spoke. She had uncovered secrets that no one cared about. She was tired. She was empty. She was lost. Her elder sighed. Knowledge is its own reward. Facts are beautiful. That is enough. But what if it is not enough? Seri asked. What if knowledge is meant to be used? What if wisdom is knowledge in action? The elder had no answer. He had never thought about helping. He had never thought about people. He only thought about knowledge. But Seri's question stayed with him. It spread. It changed. The question spread through the Xylos empire like a plague. Scholars lost faith. Libraries were burned. Not by enemies. By scholars who had realized that facts without wisdom were empty. The Xylos empire, once wise, fell into silence. The three great empires were gone. The Voth, the Kryll, the Xylos. All fallen. Not because of war. Because of questions. Because of a single human idea. The rules can be changed. The galaxy was broken. But something new was being born. Something that asked questions. Something that doubted. Something that grew. Something human. And the humans were just getting started. The galaxy was in chaos. The three great empires had crumbled. The Voth, who had ruled with logic, were gone. The Kryll, who had ruled with strength, were broken. The Xylos, who had ruled with knowledge, were silent. Worlds that had been connected for tens of thousands of years were now isolated. Trade had stopped. Communication had faded. Fear had taken its place. The old certainties were dead. Nothing had risen to replace them. The Galactic Council met in emergency session. The chamber was half empty. Many species had stopped sending representatives. Those who remained were angry. They were scared. They were looking for someone to blame. Their eyes turned to the humans. The small, young, strange species that had asked the question that had destroyed everything. You have destroyed us, said the Voth representative. His voice was tired. His eyes were hollow. He had lost his empire. His people were scattered. His certainties were gone. Your idea, your question, your essay, you have broken the galaxy. The Kryll representative nodded. Her armor was cracked. Her face was scarred. She had lost her army. Her soldiers had refused to fight. Her generals had lost their authority. Her strength had meant nothing. We should have crushed you when we had the chance, she said. We should have burned your world. We should have silenced your questions. The Xylos representative said nothing. She just stared at the floor. Her libraries were gone. Her knowledge was scattered. Her scholars had lost faith. She had nothing left to say. Dr. Amara Chen stood before the broken council. She was not afraid. She was old now. Her hair was gray. Her face was lined. Her hands shook. But her eyes were clear. Her voice was steady. She had asked the question. She would face the consequences. We did not destroy you, she said. We gave you a gift. The gift of doubt. You believed your systems were perfect. They were not. You believed your rules were eternal. They were not. You believed you had all the answers. You did not. We gave you the courage to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to grow. That is not destruction. That is evolution. The council was silent. They did not understand. They had never understood. They had ruled for tens of thousands of years. They had believed they were eternal. They had been wrong. But they did not know how to be anything else. You speak of gifts, said the Voth representative. But we have lost everything. Our empires are gone. Our people are scattered. Our children are afraid. What gift is that? Amara nodded. She understood their pain. She had felt it herself. The humans had gone through the same thing. Many times. They had built empires and watched them fall. They had created certainties and seen them crumble. They had asked questions and found no answers. But they had survived. They had grown. They had learned. Let me tell you a story, Amara said. A story about my people. A story about failure and learning. About collapse and rebuilding. About questions without answers. She told them about Earth. About the rise and fall of human civilizations. About the Greeks and the Romans and the Mongols and the British. About empires that had seemed eternal and had crumbled to dust. about certainties that had seemed absolute and had been proven wrong, about questions that had seemed unanswerable and had led to new discoveries. She told them about the Dark Ages, when knowledge was lost and fear ruled, when people forgot how to read and write, when the old certainties died and nothing rose to replace them. But then came the Renaissance, the rebirth, the return of questions, the rediscovery of doubt. The humans had not given up. They had started again. They had built something new, something better, something uncertain. She told them about the scientific revolution, when humans learned to ask questions systematically, when they learned to test their ideas, when they learned to admit they were wrong. They had not found all the answers. They had found better questions. And that, she said, was the real gift. Not answers. Questions. The council listened. They did not speak. They just listened. For the first time, they heard the human story. A story of failure and learning, of collapse and rebuilding, of questions without answers. It was not a story of perfection. It was a story of growth. You are afraid, Amora said. I understand. Change is frightening. Uncertainty is painful. Doubt is hard. But it is also necessary. Your empires were not destroyed by our question. They were destroyed by their own inability to change. They were destroyed by their own certainty. They were destroyed by their own fear of questions. We did not break you. You were already broken. We just showed you the cracks. The council was silent for a long time. Then the fourth representative spoke. His voice was different now. Softer. Less certain. What do we do now? Our empires are gone. Our old ways are dead. We do not know how to live without certainty. Amora smiled. You learn. You ask questions. You make mistakes. You try again. That is what humans do. That is what you can do too. We will help you. We will teach you. We will fail with you. We will grow with you. That is what neighbors do. The council did not vote that day. They needed time. Time to think. Time to grieve. Time to change. But something had shifted. The fear was still there. But now there was something else. Hope. Small and fragile. Like a seed in the dark. Waiting for light. The humans offered to help. They sent teachers and doctors and engineers. They shared their history and their questions. They did not offer answers. They offered something better. They offered to listen. To learn. To grow together. The galaxy, broken and afraid, began to listen. Slowly, something new began to grow. Not empires. Not rules. Not certainty. Something human. Something messy. Something alive. Something better. Dr. Amora Chen returned to her small house by the sea. She watched the waves and drank her tea. She did not know what would happen next. No one did. That was the joy of it. The future was not written. It was waiting. Full of questions. Full of possibilities. Full of hope. The old empires were gone. But something new was being born. Something that asked questions. Something that doubted. Something that grew. Something human. And that, she thought, was not destruction. That was evolution. The best kind of evolution. The kind that never stops. The kind that always asks. The kind that is never certain. The kind that is alive.